wellnesscouch.com, streaming wellness into your lives.
Welcome to Nourishing the Mother, featuring your hosts Bridget Wood and Julie Tenner.
Hello and welcome to Nourishing the Mother. I'm Bridget Wood.
And I'm Julie Tenner. And before we get stuck into today's podcast on babies, toddlers and introducing food, where we answer our listeners' questions and just kind of dive into our own experiences and inspiration well around this topic, we just love to remind you to jump onto nourishingthemother.com.au and on the homepage there to fill out a form that is Join Our Tribe with your name and email address, where once a week you'll get an email from us with all the links to everything we've posted during the week so you can pick and choose what you'd love to listen to. And possibly you'll get a second email if we're feeling inspired or driven or have faced a challenge and there's some sort of musing or personal story that we'd really love to share with you. So if you'd like to continue your learnings with us during the week, jump on to nourishingthemother.com.au and join our tribe.
So I love that we got a question like this from a listener because...
I know. How much do you love listener questions?
Yeah. And I think it's something that's relevant for so many parents, not only new parents, but even parents doing it a second time or just having young children. Because if you've listened to some of our previous podcasts around aware parenting and looking at children and the way that they control things or try to control things through food is such a multi-layered topic. It's not simply the nutrient component. It's not simply our beliefs around food. It's also what is the resistance creating in our child based on our own belief systems to do with the food. So what I really want to tackle is the practical component around how to introduce the food, so whether it's the different concepts, so baby-led weaning versus spoon feeding, and then also looking at why perhaps you might have to reintroduce foods constantly to a child and what's coming up for you around that, because like we can bring the concept of the mirror, which we talk about in Loathing to Loving, into this topic because that dynamic is so perfect for both of you, this whole around the food thing.
Sounds like you've got such a well of inspiration with it at the moment.
I think I'm just...
Because you're just immersed in it?
I'm immersed in it with both kids, right? Like I've got a 4-year-old and a nearly 1-year-old and
can't believe she's nearly 1.
I know, right? Like I can't believe that either. So I've, in fact, I'd forgotten so much. I'd forgotten so much around food. And I remember saying to you when she was about 5.5 months, oh, do I have to? Like, it just seems like so hard. I don't know if I can be bothered. Because, breastfeeding on demand is,
just becomes easier, doesn't it?
Just becomes so easy.
Yeah.
Particularly if,
you don't think of anything, you don't have to plan anything, you don't have to pack anything.
Don't take anything anywhere. Exactly. So,
I really get it.
You were like, just batch it. And it was fine. I just had to get over that. And it was fine. And what I find, I mean, we'll jump into your experience too, but what I certainly find with the way that I've fed both of my children and was really based on the principle of baby-led weaning. So it was offering food, offering a range of, what I saw as nutritious foods that they could choose from.
How did you get there, though?
How did I get there?
Choosing baby-led weaning.
Yeah, so certainly with Hugo, my experience is very much of the natural parent. I had a really strong value on whole foods and nothing processed. And in fact, I don't think I gave him anything out of a packet. Sylvie hasn't quite been so lucky. But very much of the wholesome home-cooked thing. And I'd read a lot around the traditional weaning method, which involved like rice cereal. So it's like a, fortified cereal that you can purchase. I think it's called I can't remember what it's called. It's got some particular name.
It's with F or something, doesn't it?
I want to say Forex or something like that.
Yeah, it is something like that. Yeah. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Irrelevant.
Details. And that just was like, why? And then I researched into why rice cereal had come about, and largely it was food. It was a commercialization thing. So it was a commercialization of food, and that's what that's what the big company said, here, feed your child this. Yeah. And I was like, no way am I feeding my child that. So then I looked at what nutritious foods were worthwhile starting a child on. So I looked at like avocado as a good first food, and I can't even remember now. I introduced banana probably a little bit earlier than I needed to with both kids, but it was such an easy food, banana.
It is. Yeah.
Sweet potato, just looking at simple vegetables and some fruits that weren't too high in high in their acidity to gently introduce to my child, and introducing one food every 3 to 4 days to notice if there was any kind of resistance or reaction with the food was really my approach. And I loved it too because I didn't want to be sitting there having to spoon feed my child. And I have done a little bit more of the spoon feeding with Sylvie than I did with Hugo, just simply by nature of the way that they eat. Like Hugo is very happy just to touch and feel everything and really fed himself very well through that method, whereas sometimes Sylvie does need to be spoon fed, and just that she enjoys that process. But it's like anything, I think, when you're trying to take a conscious approach to parenting, is that your child will often lead the way. And they lead the way with food, and they don't tend to eat things that they're not ready for or that they're not particularly interested in. And I remember reading a book, there's a book called Baby-Led Weaning. I think it's by Jill Rapley. I'm trying to remember if that's her name. We can put this in the show notes. But her thinking was food before one is just for fun. I don't know that that's totally true in terms of from a nutritional perspective, and I know that you would challenge that. But I think what she's trying to get at there is particularly if you're breastfeeding, from a nutrient point of view, they're going to get the most of what they need from breast milk in that first year, and that the food is largely for a couple of reasons: to help them get used to different textures on the tongue and in their mouth. And there's also the development of the gag reflex that happens between 6 and 8 months, which is useful then to have solid food in that time, so that they can start to learn how to move food through their tongue and palate, and help them to know how to avoid choking on some kinds of food. So that was the benefit that I also saw in that kind of approach to feeding. So a couple of different factors. It was motivated by my own value on food, but also what I saw as what was empowering for my child to take ownership of the food that they were putting in their mouth and how much they wanted to eat too. But food is so loaded, I think, even with babies, around perhaps the sense that we might want to congratulate them feeding, or that we might want to celebrate it, because it is a big deal, isn't it? Like the first foods are really powerful. It's such
a sign of separation or of autonomy.
Yeah, autonomy and the enjoyment, right? Particularly if you have a value on
pleasure of food.
It can be such a lovely experience to share that with your baby. And I think that that's really nice to look at it too, as opposed to simply seeing it as a chore, which is how I saw the beginning of it with Sylvie, and how I've settled much more into it now. And I think from my perspective, the reason why I do settle into it fairly easily is because I'm fortunate that both of my children don't tend to have so far any food issues, so they largely eat the family foods. So it's usually only the first 2 to 4 months of eating that they eat separate foods, and then they're straight into what we eat. So I'm not having to do multiple meals and things like that, which I really like. But what's your experience? Because you've obviously been down this path 3 different times, and you've also spent a long time in practice with parents around this topic.
Yep.
So what's your viewpoint, and how has it evolved with each child, and as you
Sorry, I'm laughing because I just think, how has it evolved? Yeah, because we all start with these philosophies and ideals, don't we?
Exactly, and I mean that's what I'm alluding to. Like Sylvia certainly had those squidgy packets and like those things that are devoid of nutrients, like what are they called, like bits of cardboard, that kind of stuff.
Like your rusks.
And rusks and stuff. Yeah.
Okay, how do I view baby-led weaning? I guess my philosophy from a naturopathic perspective is around whole, nourishing foods. What I probably learnt most poignantly or adopted most willingly in practice was I really liked the Steiner philosophy of food introduction. So, I was quite immersive in the Steiner philosophy at that point in time, and the philosophy of Steiner is so the top of the tree to the bottom of the tree, so fruit to root. And then it's things that graze on the land, so that's animals and meats.
Yeah.
And then it's grains last. And the reason for that is grains are really, really harsh and abrasive on the digestive system. We want to think that they're easier to digest than meat or eggs or dairy, but on a purely cellular level, they're not. They're actually one of the, that's why paleo eliminates grains is because they are actually one of the most causative factors of digestive issues. So grains was always last, and I really enjoyed that. What I added on top of that through learning with my first child was salicylate foods. So salicylates was a chemical component within naturally occurring foods. And typically I had seen in practice a lot of childhood-based reactions around high salicylate foods. So I then also put another layer of mediation around that food introduction of really starting with low salicylate foods and being very conscious and careful about the amounts and how often, like a threshold, that those would be consumed. Because my son in particular had huge issues with salicylates, largely when he was older, but it was certainly something I was mindful of because he had some eczema when he was younger as well. Anyway, so that was the theory. Being the firstborn of a naturopath, my son ate not a speck of anything processed, not a scrap of sugar for probably 18 months of his life. Not a thing. The world's most pure diet. And can I tell you, you have never met a bigger sugar addict.
How interesting.
And my mother-in-law delights in reveling in the
truth of that.
Yeah. And I used to get really pissy about it. And now I'm like, yeah, I get the cosmic joke. Right? I really was like the full on about taking it out of his diet, and he's totally the rebel result of that.
Yeah.
It's such the black and white aspects of parenting, isn't it? The other funny thing with my son was we did bits and pieces of baby-led weaning with him, like as sticks of stuff, but he really did enjoy a puree. So I used to do bulk batches and freeze it in ice cube trays and chuck bags of it in the freezer and just pull out what I needed each day. And he consumed a ridiculous amount of food. Like ridiculous.
He still does though, doesn't he?
Oh, he still does. He's still the most enormous eater. But even as a baby on a pureed, thing of ice cube trays, how many in an ice cube tray? Like 16 or something? You consume an entire one per meal.
Oh my gosh.
And so what was funny, right, is my son also is, tall, dark and handsome, has this beautiful olive skin. And because I was around him all the time, I didn't actually notice that because of the amount he was consuming and because I was quite restrictive on, because the other thing I didn't like was the deadly nightshade veggies.
Yeah.
So I didn't want to give him much potato and stuff like that. So he was living a lot on your orange kind of root vegetables and fruits and things like this. And he started to turn orange. He looked like someone with fake tan. But I hadn't tuned into it because he was so olive anyway.
Yeah.
And it was only when my mother-in-law had him and she'd taken him down, she lives in St Kilda, she'd taken him down Fitzroy Street for a coffee, and she said to me, I was stopped in the street by this woman today. He said, I don't want to startle you, but I'm a nurse and your grandchild is orange. He could really seriously have a liver problem.
Oh.
It was when she said that, I went, yeah, maybe, and now I look back on photos and we laugh because he has this like fake tan orange tint to his skin because of the amount he was consuming, the carotene, like a flamingo. He had turned like an orange colour.
Yeah.
And so I then had to really seriously, again, mediate what I was giving him. And so that's when I then thought, okay, this hardcore, puritanical version of solid introduction, given the amount that he's eating, is now it's not working, right? Yeah. So then I was introducing, okay, you can have a bit more potato, you can have a bit more grains, and it mellowed out into more of a diet. And the orange kind of went away. And then he was probably about 13 months old and he was still on purees and he would not touch anything
how interesting.
That was solid. Wouldn't touch it. And I decided I'd had enough of this. I was completely jackoed. I was pregnant with my second, had enough. So I just said to him, mate, you really need to start, because by one, you do really want them eating what the family food diet kind of is. And we certainly weren't there. I was still making separate foods for him. And so I spoke to him about it. I said, look, we're going to, trial this. And so each night, each meal, I would put what we were having in front of him and he wouldn't eat it.
Oh.
He's still stubborn as an ox. And so he went on a food strike for 3 days.
Oh my gosh.
For 3 days. And I still think to myself, man, my children and their iron wills, right? Like it was a battle of wills.
Yeah, yeah.
And every time I'm getting to the table, I'm giving him this food, and it was such a huge learning for me, because I also it was because I was so acutely aware of the children that I saw by the time they were 5 or 6 who had the most appalling diets and really seriously was seeing in practice because they had issues.
Yeah.
Was largely because their mothers loved them so much that when they rejected or said no to the food that was being offered, they'd go, well, what can I give you? What can I feed you? What else can you have? And so it was this constant looking for whatever the kids would eat.
Yeah.
And so largely then diets became child-led. And so you end up at 5 or 6 living on Frankfurts and white bread
foods, yeah.
and I'm not sure what else, Slurpees. You know, like these were literally the diets that I would end up seeing. And so I was also in my head going, that will not be my child.
Yes. So I'm going to win this battle.
So 3-day strike, right? And I really had to face myself in that, because that, for me, you know, food was such a sense of self and love, and here it was being rejected. And I had put in all this time and effort and spaciousness to create this amazing meal, and you weren't even touching it. Like it was this, like you really have to face a lot of yourself in that. And then at the same time, you know, casting head going, if he doesn't eat, is he going to be okay? Is he going to sleep at night? Am I going to have a shock? So you kind of puff it all out, and it really forces you to look very deeply at yourself and what was going on. Anyway, I was still breastfeeding him at the time too. So 3 days, and then he gave in and he started eating. And then he just ate normal food from there on in, and, you know, he's been a fantastic, incredible eater since then. But I do laugh now. Now I realise that was such a learning with him. So then with my second, I was like, well, I'm not doing this puree thing. I'm going to do baby-led, you know, weaning, and it's all going to be finger food and sticks of steamed whatever and blah, blah, blah. And so I spent a lot of time researching that as a concept. And then the home birthing midwife I had at the time was quite a... you know, ancient feminine archetype, a long time in the home birthing kind of institution, and she really challenged me on it.
Oh, did she?
Yeah. And she, you know, which I totally took with humour as well, because she laughed at me. She goes, such a ridiculous notion. If you put a pile of dog poo on their plate, they would pick it up.
That's a good point.
And I laughed like that, and I went, yeah, fair call.
Yeah.
So how much of baby-led weaning, you know, revolves around this concept of they can tailor themselves around what they can and can't tolerate digestively? I don't know. You know, like you've got to kind of challenge the philosophies. Yes, they're there for, you know, yes, consider the philosophies, but also check them sometimes.
I guess it's also, I guess for me, I see it almost as the difference between, in essence, putting the food in their mouth for them versus allowing them to be tactile.
Oh, absolutely.
Food.
And the other thing with food is very much a sensory experience. And so what you will find is older children and certainly adolescents with eating disorders also have texture aversions because they've never had the opportunity to play with food. So part of, you know, really working with finicky eaters, picky eaters, girls that are anorexic, boys for that matter, is to take them back to the sensual aspect of food. So you are literally starting with, you know, peeling a kiwi fruit and getting them to hold it and feel it and get comfortable with sensation. Yeah. So there's a lot around baby-led weaning that's also about expanding the sensual capacity of food and expanding your tolerance around that, I think, for sure. I was also really into it because I had the understanding that their gag reflex was so intense that as soon as something hit the back of the palate, they would be that reflex was so intense that it would force almost like a vomit. So they could never theoretically gag.
I love that idea too.
Until
it didn't work for you.
Until my second born gagged on a strawberry to the point of turning blue. And I can still tell you it was one of the scariest moments of my entire life. And I was at my mum's at the time, actually. And luckily, my husband and I were both there, so we were there for a family lunch. And my mum had always been a little bit uncomfortable with the baby-led weaning because of it's kind of a new agey sort of concept in terms of the gagging. And my mum has still never recovered from that. Like, she still says they can choke on strawberries and they can choke on grapes. You know, like, she's still, like, really intense about it. And I get it, because that was so fucking scary. And I'd turned her, you know, done the pat on, trying to smack her back to get it out of her throat, and I couldn't do it. And so I'd had to hand her over to my husband, who was going even harder to try. Like, she literally turned blue. Like, literally. Her lips were blue. And in that moment, I just thought, fuck this shit.
Totally.
Like, you can have all the philosophy you want,
Was it
right?
a whole strawberry, was it? Or?
Yeah, it was a whole strawberry.
Yeah. How old was she?
How old was she? She probably would have been about 13 months as well.
Yeah. God.
Yeah.
Yeah, grape. I steer well clear of grapes for a long time.
Well,
But
it's
strawberries. I mean, strawberries usually I would cut, but it's 13 months. Maybe not. Like, maybe I wouldn't, because if they're confident enough to be picking that up and
biting.
chopping
Yeah,
and
yeah.
all that.
Yeah, that's what I thought too. So it really was another opportunity for me to go, okay, here's philosophy.
Yeah.
And then here's really checking for what works for you
Yeah.
and what your intuition is guiding you towards as well. Like, it's such an interplay between the two.
And I mean, that's such a great you know, point to drive home with anything that you're reading, that you're thinking about introducing to your child, or is that sense check on okay, this sounds great, but what does it actually look like in practice for, you know, safety, health, in the whole spectrum? How's it going to work with my family? How's it going to work with the rest of my children? You know, if you've got other children, all of those things.
Yes, exactly.
Because there's so many factors to consider, I think.
Exactly. So, and then my third born, I still really enjoyed the Steiner philosophy, and certainly still introducing grains last. So that is how we initiated that, and she was definitely a mix between what was more convenient for me and what was more convenient for her. We're on the road a lot more, so she had a lot more finger things simply by virtue of me not being able to be there and feed her. But when I was able to be present at mealtime, I would feed her. And I do think there's a lot to be said for the presence that we bring to mealtime, as opposed to strapping them in. I think the other thing I have with baby-led weaning is it's very easy to strap them into a high chair, plonk some things in front of them and walk away.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And I think we miss, in doing that, the connection and the just the other aspects of food that come into bringing digestion in, doing the one thing, connecting and settling, making it an experience that's enjoyable. And in doing that, you're also setting up patterns and role modeling and expectation for meal times, that we sit to eat, we don't walk around and eat, our cutlery stays on the table. You know, often kids throwing food or whatever it is also because they're not feeling the presence and the connection at mealtime.
Yeah.
So I just think it's, you know, I think with her it was probably a bit more of what we could manage in a family dynamic, but I was more conscious of that connected facet, and was with my older kids by then as well, that meal times are to some extent a sacred space where they can be. They can't always be.
And I think it's also often choosing the meal time that will work the best for that.
Yes.
Like for me, it's dinner usually. With my kids, and I mean, I love what you said about the grounding nature of the food and what comes with feeding. Like even today, because obviously soups, I let Sylvie play with little bits of soup just from a sensory point of view, like almost like a finger painting. But I will spoon feed her the soup, and because she's sick at the moment, I was really like visualizing as I was spoon feeding her that being a healing soup for her, and really looking at the energy that comes with not only the food but the intention with which me feeding her sends her, and that can't be underestimated.
No, and this is the thing also with ritual around meal times. It doesn't matter if you're in, you know, a Steiner philosophy or a religious background or whatever it is, but creating intention around mealtime being a blessing, a prayer, a thankfulness, you energetically change that food, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the cellular structure literally resonates differently with a food that's been left in prayer and food that's just been
plonked in front of you.
Whatever, yeah. You know, I mean, we all know this. We energetically feel the nourishment when mum's cooked us that meal with love and intention versus you're rushed after work and can't be stuffed and you're angry or whatever. We all know the energetic intention. There's a lot to be said for that, for prayer, for manifestation, for gratitude, that you energetically change the water crystalline structure within every aspect of food, and therefore what you would consider unhealthy food can theoretically become very healthy food and vice versa. Yeah. Depending on the energetic exchange.
And I mean, that's a good point to make too. I mean, if you've got this ideal, and I'm pretty sure aspects of me had this around it needing to be perfect, organic, like, you know, cooked from scratch every time I feed my son, and I'm stressed about that and anxious.
Me too. Yeah.
Then that's not actually necessarily going to be as beneficial to your child, because that food is not embodied with a groundedness. It's not embodied with a strength and intention and a nourishment if you're kind of harried and crazy and anxious about it. And that's for everyone at every age. You know, if it becomes about control, and you've gone so far black and white about it, then how much healing is there in that?
No, I totally agree with that. I think there's a lot to be said for, you know, what is beyond the physical food itself.
Yeah.
And, you know, that all starts with creating intention around the mealtime as well. And as we kind of have touched on before, I know you wanted to talk about, you know, potentially the reflective self aspects of introducing food to our children and what that brings up for us and with us. Did you want to kind of go there?
Yeah, I mean, like at the moment, particularly with my son who's 4, he's got a whole thing around how many more mouthfuls do I have to eat?
Yeah.
So he's got this thing going on, like how many more do I have to eat so that I can either finish and go to something else or have my treat. And it's a really tricky one that we found ourselves in, because we want him to eat the nourishing food, but I also don't want it to be that he's not listening to his body and he's simply just doing what we want him to do.
Yeah.
And food, because of what our own beliefs and stories that are wrapped up in it, which all of us largely would have been told, if you don't eat all your dinner, you don't get your dessert, or, you know, you've got to finish everything that's on your plate, or whatever those patterns were and those beliefs were. It can become a very
hugely ingrained in the 70s, 80s. Maybe even into the 90s, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But certainly in the mothers that I've worked with, absolutely, that whole... And they still carry it, right? They've got to finish their plate.
Yeah.
No matter whether... So they're overriding their body signals in order to finish the plate, because it's such an ingrained... And my mum would still, like, you would get that meal for breakfast, lunch and dinner until it was finished.
Wow.
You know, like, so it's intense.
Yeah.
It's intense, and lots of us have still carried that today, and we can't walk away from our plate with food on it. So it is really interesting to consider... What is the I don't know, the belief that we're setting around listening or overriding our body signals. And young children, babies, they have absolutely, I would say under the age of 5, they have the ability to self-regulate kilojoules in, kilojoules out. So this is also why I say, sorry, excuse me, you can't ever look at a child's diet over a day. You can't make an assessment on their nutritional intake or output based on one day's diet, because as we all know, on one day they could live on air and on the next day they could eat like a horse.
Yeah.
And depending on which day you chose to take that diet record would depend on how you viewed that child's health, right? So you've got to, with children, actually look at a complete week's diet. So a full 7 days, what's going in, what's going out, and you should get a pretty good indication from that. What you will find is that children left to their own devices, no matter what their bodies are going through, illness, growth, you know, you name it, they know exactly intrinsically kilojoules out and how much kilojoules they need in to match that. Where we go wrong is with sugar. So kids' diets is kilojoules in, kilojoules out based on energy requirements to do what they need to do to grow and be. So we could give our child a juice and a lollipop and a piece of fruit, and they would have as many kilojoules as if they sat down and ate rye bread with egg and avocado and feta.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So we have control over our children's diet by offering quality food. The rest is up to them. You choose. It's no worries. You listen to your body. It's no problems. But here's the quality options. That's, I think, the point. We stock the cupboards, let them choose.
Yeah, but I mean, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because already, you know, because we're having a lot of conversations with Hugo around, because he had the great experience of feeling quite sick. He had the great experience of feeling constipated, which I saw as like a wonderful learning curve. So we
the thing is, it is, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, it's a wonderful way to tune in. So we got a book around poo and organisms and all that kind of stuff to talk about what's happening in his guts that's contributing to the feeling. And so we still talk about it now, like, the bacteria, the good bacteria and the bad bacteria, and the kinds of foods that he's eating and how that's contributing to the balance in his gut. But I still find it difficult not to put the value judgments around food. And, I really don't want to do the good, bad food thing, and I really try to talk about it in terms of sometimes foods. I mean, we choose these kinds of foods.
Which is what they try to do in kinder as well. Sometimes foods, always foods, blah, blah, blah. Yeah.
But it's amazing how much, even for a, largely whole food, pretty much pantry that I have, how much high sugar things he manages to squeeze into his day.
Yeah.
Like
dried fruits.
Dried fruits.
Yeah.
Like so much dried fruit.
So much sugar.
Yeah, and it's loaded with sugar.
Loaded with sugar.
And he will look for any sweet thing all the time. And I don't know if part of it is the kilojoule requirement, or part of it is what I wonder is like a control pad for him around how much I breastfed him as a baby, because he pretty much whimpered and I breastfed him. So he has this pattern where sometimes when he's got really, really big feelings, he will go to sugar.
And my son too, my oldest, which is interesting actually. Yeah.
So I still don't know how I sit with that sometimes. I still have to check in and go, how okay am I about him having that lolly and then this, that, and then that, and I wanted him to take ownership of his body, which also means taking ownership of what goes in. But as his mother, I also need to have governance, because he doesn't have the brain capacity and development and all those kinds of things that I have and have a responsibility for to provide in terms of nutrition and nourishment. So it's a fine line, I think, particularly when your kids hit kinder and school and they're so faced with that outside pressure of the processed food, of the constant sugar at your disposal, to really help them tune into what is nourishing for them.
It is interesting, isn't it? And here's the thing with my third, she's had the most processed, most sugar out of any of my three, and yet she's the one who doesn't care less about them. So you were over the other day and we'd found this old handbag of hers that I'd found at the bottom of a toy box that morning, and she found some lollipops in it. And I was thinking, I can't even remember. At some point I would have had, like, here you go, you can have a couple of lollies for Jay, a couple of lollies for Heath, a couple of lollies for Lola. She doesn't care about them. She's gone and stashed them and played shops with them and forgotten about them. And only just rediscovered them. And I thought, this is so interesting to me, because she's not remotely focused on sugar or on reward foods. And yet she's the one who's had the most access to them.
And that's the thing, isn't it?
Isn't it interesting?
Yeah. And it's also when if we're talking about the mirror and the dynamic interplay between you and your child, you've removed your button on it. Like, you don't have an emotional charge on it now, so she's not having to push the button.
My firstborn smashed that.
But that's right. And I mean, each child and each age takes us to those different edges of ourselves around our own belief systems and our patterns and our resistance. I even remember, like, Marcus and I used to get frustrated because Hugo as a baby would throw stuff off the high chair. And we, like, took it personally. Right? Which is, like, such a baby thing to do. But I think because I'd put so much effort into making this food, and it just felt like it was being wasted. And that was the button I had to work through. And kids are taking us to this all the time. And, I mean, food's a classic way to do that. I mean, food and behaviour and the whole power over powerlessness dynamic that happens with food is interesting too, because it's so often... There's this talk a lot in a lot of mainstream literature that you might get from the maternal child health nurse that says, you might need to introduce a food 24 times or something, because sometimes they don't like it, or, whatever it is.
But taste buds change. Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, but there's also the whole mood thing too. Like, sometimes they just don't want it because if they're not interested in what you're presenting to them beyond the food, right? Like, if they're angry with you, they don't want to eat the food you've given them. Or if they're sad, they don't want to eat... They want something sweet instead. Like, there's such a emotional component to the food as well, and it's one of the very few things that children can control. I mean, they can't control much else that happens to them apart from what they put in their body. So it's a minefield really for them and for both of you if there's real pain points, I think, around it, which you certainly would have seen in practice, I'm sure.
Oh, absolutely. I think food is one of the biggest challenges, but it's because it's so intertwined with self. And with value and worth. And we all know how hard it is just to get a meal ready at the end of the day, and particularly if you're a conscious health foodie, you largely have spent a huge amount of time, effort, mental thought to produce that meal, and to have it rejected feels like a rejection of you. So there's just so much entangled in all of it that it's, it can get really complicated. So I really love that you've touched on that, is looking at what's actually reflected emotionally with our kids in the types of foods and the way that they're seeking and the way in which they're seeking them. And it calls us into what is going on for us, what is that reflective of, and what's our boundary. Because the stronger our boundary, the safer kids feel into that. So, I just think that probably brings up all of that stuff. Nothing like food to do that.
And I think, food, the great thing within food is that there's also an opportunity to bring a level of choice too with young children. To put out the platter of mixed, nourishing foods for them to pick off what they want, for example, for the older baby or toddler. Or for the 4-year-old like my son, and then that means that it can take away some of the power stuff that can sometimes happen at the table, and can alleviate some of that resistance sometimes, and then it gives them some more choice, which is often a lot of what kids are seeking.
Yes, definitely. So we are going to wrap it up there, and if you have any further questions that you'd love us to dive into, then we would love to dive into them with you. So please email us, Facebook us, just connect with us in any way that you can, and let us know what it is that you'd really love to know about, and we would love to go there. So nourishingthemother.com.au, Nourishing the Mother on Instagram and Facebook. Connect with you, Bridget.
Yes.
I'm trying to think, what is it that we do here?
suburbansandcastles.com, and you?
Is thepleasurenutritionist.com, and we're so grateful that you tune in. We're so grateful for this tribe that
thank you.
keeps influencing each other and continuing to grow, and it's just the most gorgeous, profound experience for us. So we're really grateful
awesome
that you're part of that. And we would love you to, dive deeper and connect, more fully with us if you're feeling ready, willing and open to doing that.
Yes.
So we'll see you next week when we continue to peel back the layers on your mothering journey.
This has been a production of TheWellnessCouch.com. Check us out on Facebook and join in the conversation on Facebook.com/TheWellnessCouch. Subscribe to each show on iTunes and check us out on Twitter. The Wellness Couch, streaming wellness into your lives. Whilst the Wellness Couch presenter endeavor to provide accurate and helpful information to their listeners, these podcasts cannot take into account individual circumstances and are not intended to be a substitute for health and medical advice from a qualified health professional. You should always seek the advice of a qualified health professional before acting on any of the information provided by any of the Wellness Couch podcasts.